Ina mana,
That shows
ina reo,
the kind of interest.
ina kārangatanga maha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Suzannah Jessep ahau, no mai haere mai ki te whare te wāhi a mahi I Aotearoa. A very warm welcome to this evening to this New Zealand Institute of International Affairs event. My name is Suzannah Jessep. I'm on the board of the Institute, a director at the Asia New Zealand Foundation, and your chair this evening. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the hard work of Hamish McDougall, the Institute's executive director, who has done much of the organisation behind the scenes, and Yvonne, thank you to both, and also to Institute members, both old and new, who are critical supporters of the Institute's work. Thank you for your support, and thank you for joining us this evening. As many of you will know, the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs is one of New Zealand's longest-running independent foreign affairs institutes. It is, in fact, by my back-of-the-envelope calculation, 88 years old, which I understand is very auspicious for this evening's event, 8 being considered one of the luckiest numbers in Chinese culture. So we're off to a good start. But there are other numbers of significance this evening. This year also marks 50th year of formal diplomatic relations between New Zealand and China. And this evening we are honoured to be joined by China's ambassador to Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Cook Islands and Niue, His Excellency Dr Wang Xiaolong, to help us reflect on the evolution of our bilateral relations over this period and in the context of China's own evolving foreign policy and international relations. Ambassador Wang has wide-ranging experience in foreign relations, including having served offshore in Mongolia, Singapore and in New York, and onshore in China in roles such as the Director General of the Department of International Economic Affairs, Special Envoy for G20 Affairs, and Special Envoy for BRICS Affairs. We're also very honoured to have 2 other eminent guests joining our discussion this evening. Associate Professor Jason Young down the end, who is the Director of New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre and one of New Zealand's leading researchers and experts on New Zealand-China relations. And the equally wonderful John McKinnon, another of New Zealand's leading experts on China, who is chair of the New Zealand-China Council and has previously served as New Zealand's ambassador to Beijing twice, as well as to Washington, DC, Canberra and New York, plus a number of senior roles in Wellington. Shortly, I'm going to invite Ambassador Wang to offer some opening remarks for 25 or 30 minutes, after which I'm going to pass to Jason, who is going to offer some short remarks in response to help us open up a Q&A discussion together. We should have 20 minutes or so please do get your questions ready. I'll then pass to John, who's going to be giving our vote of thanks this evening before we adjourn to the room right here for drinks and nibbles. So you're all very welcome to join us, so please do join us afterwards. So let's begin. May I invite His Excellency Dr Wang Xiaolong to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Susan, for that introduction. Ambassador McKinnon, Jason, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First, let me thank NZIIA for organizing the event and inviting me to speak this evening. As one of the most prestigious Kiwi think tanks, the Institute has been an essential platform for the exchange of views and ideas on New Zealand's foreign relations and what happens in our world more broadly. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you my perspectives on China's foreign policy and, in this context, China-New Zealand relations. I shall begin with China's foreign policy, which, like the foreign policy of all other countries, including New Zealand, is largely an extension or a function of its domestic policies. One can hardly have a full grasp of China's diplomacy without getting to know the country's overall development goals and plans. About a month ago, the Communist Party of China convened its 20th National Congress, when General Secretary Xi Jinping delivered a report which, on the basis of reflections on the progress China made in the past decades and the lessons we have learned from that journey, charts the way forward for the country in the next 5 years and beyond, laying out China's domestic and foreign policies and strategic intentions in an open and transparent manner. The report is arguably the best guide to understanding contemporary China and where the country would go from here, both domestically and in terms of its external relations. The report reaffirms that the fundamental and central task of China's future development is to realize the second centenary goal of building China into a great modern socialist country in all respects, to advance the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation through a Chinese path to modernization. In more mundane words, the top priority for the Chinese Communist Party and government is still to pursue economic development with a view to meeting the aspirations of the Chinese people for progressively better lives. There have been allegations that China has pivoted away from economic development as its central mission, which is, I can assure you, a misconception or misrepresentation of China's policy stance. The report clearly states that development continues to be, as it has always been since the start of reform and opening up, the paramount task for the party in its drive to rejuvenate the nation. It follows that we will continue to focus on promoting high-quality economic development as the organizing theme for all our pursuits. The centrality of development is determined by what we call the principal contradiction, or the primary challenge facing China, namely the gap between unbalanced and inadequate development and people's ever-growing needs for a better life. In line with this central task, the report projects a vision for the country in the next 5 years, through 2035 up until mid-century, and identifies the long-term and structural policy frameworks, as well as the necessary institutional backstops in different areas to deliver on that vision. China's diplomacy is there to serve and support the realization of that vision. Our commitment to upholding world peace, promoting common development and prosperity, and building a global community with a shared future is first and foremost requisite to help create a peaceful and favorable external environment for our own development to take place. It also coheres with China's tradition of acting in good faith, making friends of all, and fostering good neighborliness. In addition, the CPC, since its inception 100 years ago, has taken it upon itself to promote progress for humanity on top of pursuing happiness for the Chinese people. The adoption of such a foreign policy is by no means a choice of convenience. Rather, it is a long-term, strategic, and fundamental decision. The report also points out that seeking peaceful development is a defining feature of the Chinese path to modernization. Again, we should strive to safeguard world peace and promote development to enable our own development, which will in turn empower us to make a greater contribution to the wider global cause. China has never bullied or invaded others, and it will never do so. No matter what stage of development it reaches, China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansionism. We have, though, a saying in Chinese: the trees want to stay still, but the wind keeps blowing. We are witnessing turmoil in our world, as it is undergoing profound and drastic transformations unseen in a century. Coalescing with a sluggish world economy and acute global challenges, these changes have given rise to increasing uncertainties, risks, and even outright dangers. Indeed, the world today is hardly a very peaceful place. Power politics and hegemonism are on the rise. A small number of countries blatantly bully and interfere in the internal affairs of others, create divisions and confrontations, and even stoke conflicts and wars. It is particularly concerning that on war and peace, what used to be unthinkable seems increasingly less inconceivable. Contrary to what these countries often claim, rather than live and let live, they apparently believe in live and let die. Out of a zero-sum mindset, they do not want to see other countries develop. Even worse, they proactively hinder, suppress, and contain other countries through sanctions, barriers, blockades, disruption or even severance of supply chains, and decoupling, in order to maintain their own dominance. They practice unilateralism and undermine the multilateral system, international law, and broadly accepted norms of international relations, eroding the mutual trust and the institutional foundation which are essential if we are to address global issues through global cooperation. Such egregious behaviors, albeit by a small number of countries, not only pose challenges to China's development, and also seriously damage the interests of the international community as a whole. The world has come to yet another crossroads, and its future will be decided by all countries' respective and collective decisions. As far as we are concerned, the report to the Party Congress clearly proclaims China remains firm in pursuing an independent foreign policy of peace. Accordingly, we'll always decide our position and policy on issues based on their own merits, uphold the basic norms of international relations, and safeguard global fairness and justice. China will adhere to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in seeking to establish friendly relations with all other countries in the world. China will want to challenge or compete against no one. Rather, we want to work with everyone to deepen and expand global partnerships based on equality, openness, and mutual benefit. China will play an active part in global governance, practice true multilateralism, and promote peace, development, and extensive cooperation in addressing global challenges such as climate change and pandemic response and preparedness. China is committed to its fundamental national policy of opening up to the outside world and will contribute to building an open world economy that facilitates the development of all countries, particularly developing ones. President Xi has stated on many occasions that China's door will never close, it will only open wider. At the opening ceremony of the 5th China International Import Expo a few days ago, the President further pointed out that China will work with all countries and all parties to share the opportunities from its vast market, from its institutional opening up, and from deepened international cooperation. In a nutshell, the 20th National Congress of CPC has drawn up a blueprint for China's future development, an open and steadily growing China, a China that is committed to promoting peace and development and addressing global challenges, and a China that seeks win-win cooperation will continue to offer new opportunities for the world and lend stability and certainty to the otherwise turbulent and increasingly uncertain international landscape. Next, I would like to discuss briefly 3 issues that may be of interest to New Zealand foreign policy circles and that are relevant to China-New Zealand's relationship. First, values and foreign policy. This issue has come up frequently in recent discourse on international relations and foreign policy. Indeed, every country has its own values, which are inevitably reflected in its domestic and foreign policies. The values of a country, a nation, or a society are the product of its circumstances, including its history, culture, and social system. It should be no surprise, therefore, that differences in national conditions might lead to divergences in values, so that the values across the world have been and will continue to be diverse by nature. In this sense, history has not ended and never will. In fact, attempts to unify the world with a particular and uniform set of values have never succeeded. Instead, they have, without exception, ended in tragedy. As the famous German philosopher Hegel observed, however, the only thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. The way the world has evolved suggests, unfortunately, that there are countries in today's world trying to judge other countries by their own values and divide the world along values-based fault lines. Some go as far as attempting to impose their own values on other countries. Values have even been weaponized to suppress other countries to maintain dominance or hegemony, which has become a root cause of rising instability and uncertainty in the world. One of the biggest challenges facing the international community will thus be how to make sure that countries with different values and political and social systems can coexist and cooperate with one another. We have to, for the alternative would be a recipe for disaster. We should also acknowledge that even between seemingly very different value systems, there might be many commonalities and similarities, which constitute the basis for different countries to coexist peacefully and even harmoniously, cooperate for mutual benefits, and join hands to address common challenges. This is why China recognizes and cherishes the role of values in international relations and advocates the humanities' shared values of peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom as a cornerstone for building a community of shared future for mankind. The humanities' shared values advocated by China are different from the universal values advocated by some countries. The so-called universal values is top-down, self-centered, arrogant, and even hegemonic. And their essence is to use one's own values as a mold to shape other countries or even the whole world into one model. In contrast, humanity's shared values is bottom-up, based on equality and mutual respect, and as a result, democratic, recognizing and respecting the diversity between countries, and on that basis, finding the common denominator or common denominators among them. The latter approach would also allow for some of the same concepts, such as democracy and freedom, to be interpreted and applied in different countries in ways aligned with their own respective national context. This is what the ancient Chinese called harmony amidst diversity. Such harmony amidst diversity is not only necessary, but also possible. Although we're different from one another, at the end of the day, our commonalities and common interests far outweigh our divergences. As long as we treat each other on the basis of mutual respect and equality and refrain from imposing on others, we can then have coexistence rather than conflict, dialogue rather than estrangement, and mutual learning rather than arrogance. China's choice for values, social system, and path to modernity are made by our own people based on our own history, culture, and realities. And these choices have been proven to be suitable and effective to solve China's problems and meet the needs of the Chinese people. There's no reason whatsoever why we shouldn't adhere to them unswervingly down the road. By the same token, China respects the choices made by other peoples based on their national conditions, and will never attempt to use our values as a yardstick to judge or change others, much less to impose on them. China stands ready to conduct dialogues and exchanges on the basis of mutual respect and non-interference in each other's internal affairs to promote mutual understanding and mutual learning. We reject, however, finger-pointing or lecturing, or attempts by anyone to impose their values and systems upon us. The second issue I wish to talk about is international rules and international order. The importance of international rules and order goes without saying. All the more so at a time when the world is beset by sharp contradictions and unprecedented challenges. Without fair and effective international rules and order, the world will revert to the era of the law of the jungle. In this regard, one narrative that is heard constantly these days is the imperative for us to uphold and abide by a rules-based international order. What is meant here? What and whose order? And what and whose rules? Is that what we need? In this connection, I would like to stress 4 points from China's angle. First, international rules and order should be, by definition, international, meaning that they should be based on, conform to, and serve the common interests of the international community, rather than the narrow self-interests of one or a few countries. Second, international rules and order should be jointly formulated and upheld through equal participation and consultation by the international community rather than by one or a few countries. Third, China and the overwhelming majority of members of the international community acknowledge and support the international system with the United Nations at its core, the international order based on international law, and the basic norms governing international relations based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. The reason why they are widely subscribed to by the international community is that the international rules and order they represent not only embody democracy and inclusiveness, fairness and justice, but also have proven to be the most effective in practice. If the so-called rules and order are merely the domestic laws of one or a few countries, or the private rules laid down by an exclusive small group of countries, and if a few countries use their own rules and order as a bludgeon to sanction or damage others, and coerce others to choose sides, then I'm afraid it is essentially unilateralism masquerading as multilateralism, or brazen bullying for self-interest in the name of fairness and impartiality. Fourth, compliance with and maintenance of international rules and order is a shared obligation and responsibility of all countries. Once the commonly accepted rules are in place, all countries, rather than only the small and the weak, should comply with them, and should do so consistently, rather than only when compliance suits one's narrow interests. China and New Zealand share a common or similar position on supporting multilateralism, the United Nations, and international law. We should strengthen communication and coordination between us, and together with the majority of the international community, act as builders of world peace, contributors to global development, and upholders of international order. The third issue I want to discuss here is the Taiwan question and China's reunification. Briefly, 3 observations in the context of the CPC 20th National Congress report's pronouncement on this issue. First, the essence and crux of the Taiwan question is China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Either from historical or legal perspectives, Taiwan is unquestionably part of China, and people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait belong to the same family of Chinese people. From the international instruments on the post-war order at the end of World War II, to UNGA Resolution 2758, to the political commitments made by more than 170 countries upon establishing diplomatic relations with China, the status of Taiwan is crystal clear. Namely, there is but one China in the world. Taiwan is part of China, and the government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government representing the whole of China. This trifecta lies at the heart of the One China principle, which is widely accepted international consensus and the political foundation for China's bilateral relations with other countries in the world. Second, solving the Taiwan question and achieving the complete reunification of the motherland is the common aspiration of all Chinese people and an essential requirement for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The CPC 20th National Congress report further clarifies our overall strategy on the Taiwan question and sets forth in its relation two lists, one positive and the other negative. The positive list refers to what we proactively promote, including the reaffirmation that peaceful reunification and one country, two systems is the best way to achieve reunification, and the reaffirmation of our continued efforts to promote cross-strait exchanges and cooperation with the utmost sincerity and efforts, and to promote extensive cross-strait consultations for the prospect of peaceful reunification. The negative list encapsulates what we resolutely oppose and would thus want to prevent, including most prominently two inviolable red lines that must not be crossed, namely, one, intervention by external forces, and two, secession or independence of Taiwan from China by a small number of separatists. To forestall these scenarios, the report reiterates the long-held position that China will not undertake to renounce the use of force and retains the option to take all necessary measures. These two lists combine to illustrate very clearly that our policy of peaceful reunification is unwavering and unchanged, and at the same time, our resolve to safeguard our national sovereignty and territorial integrity is unwavering and unchanged. There have been our consistent policy across successive generations of leadership and government. The false narrative being spinned by some regarding China having changed its policy on Taiwan is nothing but an attempt at smearing China to create tension, division, confrontation, and even war across the Taiwan Strait and in the Asia-Pacific region. Their ulterior motive is to use this as cover and justification for maintaining their hegemony, even at the expense of peace and stability in the wider Asia-Pacific region. If you read the 20th National Congress report, you find their narrative ill-founded. We believe that countries in the Asia-Pacific region understand the stakes involved and will form their judgment that serve their best interests. Third, adherence to the One China principle is the best guarantee for maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait. Conversely, violation or deviation from the One China principle will pose a direct threat to peace in the Taiwan Strait and negatively impact peace and stability in the wider Asia-Pacific region. Conflict or war in the Taiwan Strait is no doubt the last thing China wants to see, because Taiwan is part of our home and the people in Taiwan are our fellow countrymen. Nor is the prospect of war or conflict in the interests of the parties in the Asia-Pacific region, including New Zealand. Not long ago, the visit to Taiwan by US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the subsequent further provocations by the US directly led to a sharp rise in tensions across the Taiwan Strait, which also posed serious risks to peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. We hope that the US side will act responsibly, cease the unjustified and uncalled-for provocations, and return to the One China principle they themselves have committed to. China also hopes that all countries that support peace in the Taiwan Strait and are concerned with peace and stability in the region will work together to ensure compliance with the One China principle and to oppose provocations in violation of the principle, which is in the common interest of all parties concerned. Finally, let me turn to China-New Zealand relations. We shall soon be celebrating 50 years of our diplomatic relationship, which is an important milestone for both of us. Looking back, our relations have indeed come a long way, by any measure or any standard, as a result of tremendous efforts on both sides, bringing material, tangible benefits to both countries, particularly both peoples. As compared with 50 years ago, we're seeing between us today more frequent and closer high-level political exchanges, exponentially stronger economic and trade ties, deeper people-to-people links, and better communication on international and regional affairs. Many firsts have been created along the way, making China-New Zealand relationship a clear leader in China's relations with the Western developed countries. The entry into force earlier this year of RCEP and the upgrade protocol of our bilateral FTA has injected new impetus into our cooperation. According to Stats New Zealand, our bilateral trade in 2021 reached 37.7 billion New Zealand dollars. In the first 3 quarters of this year, it has surpassed 29 billion New Zealand dollars, with an increase of 13.3% year-on-year, showcasing the depth and resilience of our practical cooperation. Since day one of our diplomatic relations, our common interests and differences have always coexisted with each other. However, the half-century of cooperation between China and New Zealand has amply demonstrated what we have in common far outweighs our differences. Despite the changes in our respective countries and around us in the world, common interests and mutually beneficial cooperation remain the mainstream of China-New Zealand relations. Let me give you some examples. Both sides put our people front and center. Both are committed to maintaining peace and stability and promoting common development and prosperity. Both support free trade and an open world economy. Both support multilateralism and international cooperation to tackle global challenges. Both pride ourselves on independence in our foreign policy. And both oppose military alliances, taking sides and targeting third parties or subjecting ourselves to them in conducting our relations. These commonalities between us provide the two countries with a solid basis and ample space to cooperate both at a bilateral level and internationally. In a world with growing uncertainties, it is no surprise that China-New Zealand relations are facing more challenges. However, the greater the uncertainties around us, the more certainties we should jointly create for each other through closer cooperation on the way forward. The aim is to benefit our peoples, address common challenges, and at the same time contribute to world peace and prosperity. Meanwhile, we have no intentions of shying away from our differences or divergences. Rather, we stand ready to resolve and manage our differences through constructive dialogues rather than megaphone diplomacy to ensure, in the words of Prime Minister Ardern, that differences would not be allowed to define our relationship. In this sense, managing differences is at least as important as expanding cooperation, because China-New Zealand relationship is an organic whole, different parts of which interact with one another. In this connection, it is useful to note that optics and perceptions are important, as they will shape people's perspectives, which may in turn substantially impact the substance of the relationship. Thus, national branding based on wide public perception is a central variant in the equation of relations between states. In China, there is widespread cognizance of New Zealand as a green, clean, open, and friendly country. This very positive national branding is one of the most valuable assets and arguably one of the strongest pillars of our relationship. One recent example of national branding at work relates to CIIE, the Import Expo, which has just concluded over the weekend. In the short space of a week, I have seen at least 3 separate reports in China Central Television primetime news on the Expo that contains a substantial element on products from New Zealand. Publicity can hardly get any better than this in China, and it is free. It is palpable in the reactions from the people interviewed that the mere mention of New Zealand would strike a chord, which largely underpins the increasing trajectory of contractual values for New Zealand export to China at the Expo or otherwise, and is extremely gratifying to me as ambassador to the country. We need to bear in mind, though, that such a reputation has been gradually built up with hard work over the years from both sides, and hence should be carefully nurtured and protected. That requires inputs from governments, including our political leaders, through, among other things, their public messaging, from competent and responsible media, and from members of the public on both sides. Looking ahead to the next 50 years of our relationship and beyond, we hope both countries would cherish the hard-won historical achievements and seize new opportunities to expand our partnership. We should work together to implement the consensus reached by our leaders, meet the aspirations of our two peoples, and bring our relations to a new height, so that we can better benefit our peoples and make greater contribution to the world. While maintaining current positive momentum of our practical cooperation, we could as well tap the potentials offered by new areas of collaboration, including climate change, sustainable agriculture, biomedicine, and broad scientific and technological innovation. We should continue to facilitate exchanges at all levels, jointly uphold multilateralism, and maintain international and regional peace and stability, support common development, thus giving increasing substance to the comprehensive strategic partnership between us. Before concluding, I want to emphasize again that China's expectation for the development of China-New Zealand relations has not and will not change. China's firm commitment to deepening friendship between our two countries has not and will not change. And China's sincere aspiration to work with New Zealand to promote peace, stability, and development in the world has not and will not change. I firmly believe that China-New Zealand relations have great potentials and a promising future, and that our cooperation is in the interest of both sides and the whole world. We look forward to working with New Zealand to bring about that common bright future for both our countries. Thank you. I would suppose, I apologize for taking a bit longer than I had planned. That there's so much to talk about. Thank you again.
Kirsten? Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those remarks. I'd now like to pass to Associate Professor Jason Young, who's going to offer some comments in response. Thank you.
Thank you, Suze. 尊敬的王孝龙大师，各位来宾，女士们、先生们，晚上好。Tēnā tātou katoa and good evening. And firstly, thank you, Ambassador, for some really stimulating and interesting comments. I'm going to keep my comments really, really short so that we have time for Q&A. And my comments will mainly focus on the New Zealand-China relationship, which is obviously this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of that diplomatic relationship. So I thought it was notable that in Ambassador Wang's speech, he noted the importance of engagement and the mutually beneficial relations between New Zealand and China over the last 50 years. And I think there are three areas which I would include if we are looking to the next 50 years. So the first is this point about people-to-people engagement between New Zealand and China, which I think is a really important strength in the relationship. Families, business people, intrepid travellers, students, many students from China, academics and artists. And these have grown phenomenally and are a really important part of having a resilient relationship. And here also I think it's not controversial to state that in recent years and continuing today, that both COVID and politics have had a detrimental impact on these relations. And hopefully not to be too alarmist, I think it's fair to state that restrictions, as they continue, are a major impediment for New Zealanders to engage with China and could have a long-lasting impact. Now, the second area, which the Ambassador has already mentioned, is the area of the environment. So here in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, we frame it as kaitiakitanga, and in China is framed as Shantai Wenming, or ecological civilization. And I agree with the Ambassador that I think that this is a particularly rich area for cooperation between New Zealand and China. And I was really pleased to see that last week, China's special climate envoy, Xie Zhenhua, reiterated China's commitment to reaching carbon neutrality and stressed the importance of multilateralism and cooperation to solve this problem. But I also think it's important that we note that both New Zealand and China, amongst a whole number of countries, are yet to reach a level of commitment to actually solve this growing issue. And the third area is, as the Ambassador mentioned, the economy. And I think here the New Zealand and Chinese economies still remain complementary. But I also think that the years of rapid growth, particularly following the signing of the historic 2008 Free Trade Agreement, are now well behind us, and we're really in a different period of building value in the economic relationship. But I also think that with the mutual trade and economic interests between New Zealand and China, whilst these are incredibly important, on their own, they're not enough to maintain resilience in the New Zealand-China relationship. And here I think we should take note of the notes of concern from the Ambassador about the international environment. And this is a concern that's shared by many people in New Zealand. The Ambassador mentioned turmoil, growing power politics, mentioned a lot of other countries. Many of those other countries New Zealand would also share values and interests with, and also mentioned questions about hegemony and how the new international order is unfolding. And we've also seen the growth of security concerns around the world, including in China, where defence capabilities continue to grow, and such concerns are beginning to dampen the global economy. We see a shift towards unilateralism, and we see power politics, strategic tensions, and competition, including in our region and in the South Pacific, which is deeply troubling to many people in New Zealand. So considering these international trends, how resilient is the New Zealand-China relationship going forward in the next 50 years? And I think at one level, as the Ambassador alluded to and expressed eloquently, it's incredibly resilient because many of the fundamentals within the relationship are still very strong. Shared interest on global issues, climate change, strong relations amongst our peoples, and of course mutual interests in trade. And of course, as we've seen over the last 50 years and continue to do today, we see a strong commitment from both governments in fostering the relationship. But at another level, and I think the Ambassador alluded to this today as well, there are some challenges And one of the challenges which the ambassador talked about was the question of difference. And here, quoting from a previous speech the ambassador gave at the New Zealand-China Council, he stated, and I quote, "The relationship has its fair share of challenges, the foremost of which is the way we address the differences between us." And here I often read a classic Chinese quote called "qiu tong cun yi," which is used to describe the Chinese approach to managing difference, which roughly translates as seek common ground whilst recognizing the existence of differences, with the emphasis, as the ambassador did tonight, squarely placed on the question of seeking common ground. And many, I believe, in New Zealand would very much agree with this sentiment and see that as one of the fundamental bases of the New Zealand-China relationship. But at another level, as the Prime Minister has noted, differences cannot be put to the side. And this is borne out in our media coverage, in our public opinion, and in our diplomacy. And so, at one level, it must appear strange when New Zealanders celebrate the people-to-people relationships, we celebrate the economic development, the strong political relationship, but then on the other hand, we also see within the media, within academia and public discourse, there is still very much a strong focus on difference, for questions around human rights, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or questions about differences in terms of international policy. So rest assured, Ambassador, this approach is not a particular approach for New Zealand's relationship with China, but more a question of the fundamental New Zealand social and political system. And it's an approach, I would argue, that's born out of our own history, born out of our own reckoning with our own troubled history. It is an approach that I would argue that seeks meaningful engagement and dialogue, and meaningful engagement and dialogue on the basis of the shared trust that has been built over the last 50 years. And I also argue that for China, how differences are handled, not just with New Zealand, but all over the world, I think will be the cornerstone of its rise to great power status. And so for the next 50 years, I think the New Zealand-China relationship, particularly for China, the New Zealand relationship is a really interesting case where you have a fiercely independent and liberal economy and society that is very open to dialogue and debate and to furthering relations with China. And so in my comments, I'd like to thank the Ambassador for a really stimulating and interesting talk, and simply say that I think that a resilient relationship is a mature one where we can discuss and debate our differences, but at the same time celebrate our commonalities and come to new understandings, agreements, and cooperation. So once again, thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks very much, Jason, for those remarks. I would now like to open the floor to your questions. We have 2 roving mics. We've got about 15 minutes. For those who would like to make opening remarks before your question, can I please just ask you that you keep those remarks fairly succinct so that we can get around a number of questions. I believe, Hamish, there was a question. Yep. Great, thank you. Perhaps if you're happy to introduce yourself as well, that would be great.
Absolutely. My name's Peter Nichols, member of the Institute. Your Excellency, thank you for an insightful and informative address. I was very pleased to hear your comments about China's position on promoting peace, stability and development, and your comments on the rules-based order. Could you please clarify for me the factors that China considered in relation to its foreign policy on the current situation in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you for asking that question, because I think with or without the question being asked, Ukraine, what happens there is one of the questions that will weigh on people's minds, as evidenced by some of the discussions being had by the leaders. The East Asia Summit has just concluded, and the upcoming G20 and APEC summits as well. From day one, we have made it very clear at different levels, even by President Xi himself, that on this issue, we stand for peace and oppose war very clearly. At the same time, we advocate that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected and safeguarded, and the legitimate concerns of all countries, including on issues in relation to security, must be addressed seriously. And most important of all, we have consistently advocated a peaceful and negotiated solution to the issue, because as we see it, as been vehemently evidenced by what has happened so far, this issue cannot be resolved on the battleground. It can only be sorted out through negotiations. And so we have consistently through our own channels, because we are friends to both Russia and Ukraine. So we've been encouraging the two of them to talk to each other. But for that to happen, I think all members of the international community will have to pull in the same direction. But apparently that there are forces that are trying to pull the matter into different directions. But at the end of the day, I think people will realize, both on the part of the parties directly concerned, but also on other members of the international community, that as major stakeholders in what happens, there's the only way out would be a negotiated settlement. And hopefully we could all support the parties concerned to seek an early resolution along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from the floor? Don't be shy. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lau, member of the Institute. It seems the United States is provoking a proxy war in Taiwan to weaken China. Sir John Key, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, said Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was highly provocative and reckless. My question, Dr. Wang, do you think the United States is interfering in China's sovereignty and internal affairs regarding Taiwan, since the United States and UN abide by the One China principle, which states that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a short answer and a long answer to that question. The short answer is yes, the United States is interfering in the internal affairs of China by sending Speaker Pelosi on that visit. And through its follow-up provocations since then. And the long answer is that the United States has done this in violation of their own commitment on the One China principle, what they call the One China policy. But however you frame it, the core of the concepts are still the same. There is only one China, and Taiwan is part of China. And the United States, within the framework of their commitment on the One China, what they call the One China policy, they committed to having only unofficial relations with Taiwan. But the visit by the number 3 official in their hierarchy, in the governmental hierarchy, is anything but unofficial. In fact, it cannot or hardly get any more official than this. So this has serious implications for the Taiwan question, for peace and stability in Taiwan Strait. And obviously, it is the United States, contrary to what they claim. It is the United States and some separatist forces within Taiwan that are trying to change the status quo, which poses a direct threat to peace and stability across Taiwan Strait and in the wider Asia-Pacific region. So that's why we've resolutely opposed the visit, and we've asked the Americans to stop their provocations and return to the track of the One China principle or One China policy. I understand that there will be discussions in the bilateral meeting, bilateral summit that will take place very soon. And I've seen reports on the comments made by President Biden on this, his intention to discuss with President Xi on some of the red lines for both in the relationship. If we're going to talk about red lines, as far as at least China is concerned, there is no red line redder than the Taiwan question. And hopefully they could see the seriousness of the issue and come back again to the One China policy they themselves have committed to.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have got a question here. Sorry, if you could just raise your hand a little. Thank you.
Thanks. Les Holbrook, retired professor, previous Vice-Chancellor at Victoria and a long-standing member of the Institute, including as an office holder. I was just reflecting that it's now more than 20 years ago that I had the honour of representing Victoria University at the centenary of Baida in Beijing, a university, of course, that reached its centenary just a year ahead of ours. So we felt we had quite a lot in common, and we had a very good relationship. And the thing that sticks in my mind most from those celebrations is hearing the then President of China, Jiang Zemin, say that it was part of the role of Chinese universities to give intellectual leadership to the party. Now, I wonder whether that doctrine has changed in the meantime or been amended, because at the time it seemed to us to be a promise of greater intellectual freedom within the Chinese university system. And although there are clearly still very strong links and very strong exchanges, that doesn't quite seem to have happened. I wonder, does the current President Xi's thought throw new light on this question?
Well, education is one of the most important areas that the President stressed in his report to the Party Congress, because education has to do with intellectual development of the nation. It has to do with the ability to innovate so that we could build a more innovative economy. That would be essential if we are going to compete in today's environment in the world. So I think we attach as one of the preeminent priority areas for the government and for the party to development, and as part of that effort we support to education, and as part of that effort we support the development of our tertiary institutions, particularly the leading schools like Beida and Tsinghua. You may have noticed that some of our leaders are graduates from these prestigious institutions, including the President himself, who is a graduate from Tsinghua University, the next door neighbor to Beida. And also some of his other colleagues in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and also the current Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, who is a graduate of Beida itself. So I think that shows the contributions intellectually, both politically and intellectually, these universities have made to the development of the nation. And that is only a small example. But if you look at the broader economic and social development, it wouldn't have been possible without education playing a big role in driving the development of the broad society, economically or otherwise.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've got a question down that side. Yes. Sorry, Mr. Keating, first of all, down there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think we all really enjoyed your presentation this evening. My name is Colin Keating. I'm a former New Zealand ambassador to the United Nations. I'm also a member of the Institute. Ambassador, I think all New Zealanders would have been very pleased to hear your characterisation of China's foreign policy aspirations with respect to the multilateral system. I think this is indeed an important point of commonality. You even seem to be going so far as to say that this was an area of particular future potential for New Zealand and China to work together. So I would be very pleased if you could elaborate on that a little, but also to comment on the question a little more in response to the question about the situation in Ukraine. I mean, you rightly said that ultimately a solution has to be a negotiated one. I think everybody knows that. But as Prime Minister Ardern has said, one of the inhibitions in producing better negotiated solutions in the world at the moment is the structural difficulties in our multilateral system, particularly the United Nations and its Security Council. So I'd be interested if you could reflect on whether or not you see, as part of the process of encouraging negotiated solutions to many of the issues around the world, the need to improve the structures of the United Nations system. Thank you.
Thank you. On our shared support for multilateralism between New Zealand and China, let me tell you one small story. I told this to many of my MFAT colleagues because when I joined the Foreign Service and started as a junior officer, one of the first books I was given to read is a blue-covered compendium compiled by MFAT colleagues from New Zealand called the United Nations Handbook. Yeah. That is the introductory material I was given to read, and that helped to open a lot of doors for me in my career. And that's only a small example of the commitment on the part of New Zealand, as well as the contributions New Zealand has made to multilateralism. And another, I think, a more recent example is, for example, what is going on in Egypt at COP27. One of the biggest issues, biggest topics is loss and damage, what we could do together to make sure that we provide support on that front for some of the developing countries that have been affected by climate change. And on this issue, New Zealand has spoken loud and clear, and you've made your announcement for the donation. You've made clear where you stand, particularly in relation to some of the Pacific partners in the region. And we share that concern, we share that support. And we have made clear as well that we support such an initiative. And even if, as a fellow developing country, we're not obligated to make donations to a facility like this, we've made it clear that we will be willing to donate, to contribute. So this is, I think, another example of the shared approach to some of the challenges we face as a global community and some of the solutions we might work out together as such in a community. And as for the negotiated solution for the Ukrainian situation, I think it is up to the parties concerned directly to make that call for themselves. First and foremost, Ukraine and Russia. But of course, with the support of the broader international community and within the framework, hopefully, of international law, particularly the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Those, I think, would be the guideposts that could facilitate an eventual solution that will meet with the support, first and foremost, of the parties directly concerned, but also the wider international community.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. We've got a couple of minutes remaining. Can I just take a couple of last questions? I'm going to group them together, please, and then, Ambassador, we might ask you to just give quick comments and then we'll pass to Mr McKinnon. Great, thank you.
Mike Smith's my name, member of the Institute. I was really interested, Ambassador, and thank you very much for a great speech. When you introduced the subject of values as your opening comments, our Prime Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, stressed the importance of a value-based foreign policy for New Zealand in her remarks to diplomats in Waitangi when she took up the job and later on the New Net Goes Fishing. And I presume there's been some dialogue in terms of what the Chinese response in terms of Chinese values might be. And I would really like to know, are there places we can go to join that dialogue or hear more about it? And perhaps if a few brief comments from you I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just take our second question. Thank you.
William Hovard, Massey University. Just quickly, could you just explain to us what China's thinking in terms of opening up its borders and dealing with the COVID pandemic, and when we can reintegrate with your people internationally?
Great. Thank you very much. Ambassador, over to you.
Okay. First on values. I think I made it very clear in my presentation that our quarrel is not with a values-based foreign policy as such, but we do have a problem with the approach being taken by some of the countries on values-related issues. Whether it's that we are having dialogues on the basis of mutual respect and mutual learning, or people are trying to point fingers at others, trying to impose their own values and social systems upon other countries. I think that is the issue, rather than the values themselves. And in terms of the values cherished by New Zealand and by China, I don't think they're that much different, because the biggest common denominator would be the humanity which we all cherish dearly. And we all value peace and development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom, although they may mean slightly different things in the context of different countries. That would be understandable, I think, given the differences between countries in terms of circumstances. And on COVID restrictions, you must have noticed that over the weekend we have made some new announcement on further easing some of the measures that have been in place. and that reflects the overall approach we've been taking towards COVID. That is a dynamic zero COVID approach, meaning that we've been constantly optimizing or adjusting the measures on the basis of the latest science and also on the basis of the latest data. And I think we'll continue to do so. If you look at the current measures as compared to several months ago, we've come really a long way. It used to be, for example, quarantine, managed quarantine, used to be 21 days, and now it's down to 5 days, and plus 3 days of homestay. So that's, I think, has gone a long way towards making a lot easier for people to travel across borders. And we'll continue that process, and hopefully either going nearer the end of the year and early into next year, I think we'll be go even further in terms of the easing of those measures.
Great. Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm going to now pass to John, who's going to offer a vote of thanks on our behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suze, and thanks to all of you for coming along. And I'm just going to offer a few brief thoughts and then do the thanks properly. But I just wanted to say we're meeting here because, of course, it's the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and New Zealand. And if we go back 50 years, and it's perhaps easier for me to do that from some others in the audience, there were probably two big motivations from New Zealand's part. I don't speak for China here, and wanting to do that, quite apart from looking around the world and discovering we might have been left behind. But one was that China was a very important country and we needed to have the ability to talk to it direct. And the second was that despite that, it was a very different country from us. And in fact, I don't think people really can perhaps always realise just how different China seemed to be in 1972 from what it is now. And to my mind, those two factors still are key in what we do now. We interact with China because it's important. We interact with it despite the fact that we have big differences. Back in the 1970s, the big differences were things like Chinese nuclear testing, support for communist parties in Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. We have different issues now, but how we handle them and how we interact with China is how, as you say, we are able to characterise and define our relationship. Now, 50 years is a long time. One thing I can be very sure of is I'm not going to be around in 2072 when we have the 100th anniversary of the relationship. But I suspect the elements which have come into play between then and now and then will still be the case. A good political relationship, a flourishing economic relationship, and very strong people-to-people links. And my one plea tonight, and this is picking up a point that Jason made, but also was just made in one of the questioners, is that for the moment, because of the COVID restrictions, we have been very light on the political interaction and very light on people-to-people exchanges. And the sooner we can move on from that, the better it will be for the overall health of the relationship and our ability to understand what is happening in China. We don't always agree with it, but we will have a better understanding if we're able to go there. I'm now the chair of the New Zealand-China Council, and I keep saying next year's going to be better. I've been saying this for some years. But I do hope that next year I'll be able to lead a group of the China Council to China and that we'll be able to interact with people there. And I think that will be something which will be worthwhile for its own sake, but also for what it signals in terms of the overall relationship. Thank you all for coming. Thanks the NZIIA for its hosting of this event. Thanks to the Wellington Club for providing the venue. But thank you especially to Suze, to Jason, but above all to Ambassador Wang for what I think was a very comprehensive presentation and which gave us a strong sense of what animates Chinese policy domestically and internationally. We may not always agree with that, but we find it valuable to hear from you about that. So please join me in expressing your thanks in the normal way.
Right, everyone, you'll be very pleased to know that drinks were being poured next door. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you to our members for your ongoing support. Please do join us. It's provided by the Institute, so thank you. That's us.